Hey, this is Zulem Urbina, and tune into the relay for the latest news in boxing all around the world. Thank you for supporting myself and other female boxers. We truly appreciate it.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. Per tweet from Michael Benson, Ring Magazine have removed Gary Russell Jr. from their featherweight rankings due to inactivity. As a result, Emmanuel Navarrete is now the number one guy, and Kid Galahad is number two. A unification between them, if made, would be for the vacant Ring Magazine title. And
it's only right.
Might seem strange to some that a reigning champion be removed from a division's ranked standings. It might seem strange to some that that champion is, in fact, the longest reigning champion in the featherweight division. But a closer look reveals why. Gary Russell is the most inactive featherweight in the featherweight division.
As far as the top 10 guys go.
As far as the champions. And there's no excuse for it.
You can't blame it on the pandemic.
You really can't. Gary Russell Jr. has been on this sparse schedule of activity for years, before the pandemic even kicked off, before the pandemic even started.
And there's no excuse for it.
There isn't. There might be a small contingent of boxing fans that hold Gary Russell Jr. in high regard, in high esteem, because he's only ever lost to Vasyl Lomachenko. But when you think about it, maybe the reason that's the only guy that ever beat Gary Russell Jr. is because Gary Russell Jr. barely fights.
He's an absentee champion.
Longest reigning champion that he might be. Maybe it's because Gary Russell Jr. seldom ever gets out there to defend that championship, to defend that title.
And he shouldn't be encouraged.
Gary Russell Jr. has been talking a good one for years. Look, I acknowledge that Leo Santa Cruz, for a long time, he didn't want nothing to do with this guy. Leo Santa Cruz, who reigned as a featherweight champion parallel to Gary. I understand that Gary wanted that fight, and it seems a lot like Leo Santa Cruz didn't. It seems like Leo was protected from Gary the same way that he was protected from Guillermo Rigondeaux years ago.
I get it.
But that's just one guy. That's just one fight. What, your entire career is centered around fighting Leo Santa Cruz, so much so that you're going to let your best years pass you by?
This is no less than he deserves.
Gary Russell Jr. himself once said that he's not an according to Hoyle PBC fighter. He's not actually stuck on the island. He's got a good business relationship with them, but he's free to go to other places, and yet he hasn't gone anywhere.
Neither has his career.
And it's his own fault. I don't care who you think Gary Russell Jr. would beat in a fight, because the man isn't fighting. Hypothetical scenarios are no substitute for activity, actual fights, actual title defenses. It's only right he be bumped off the divisional rank standings.
I think he should be stripped as well.
We're coming up on 19 months of inactivity. 19 months that Gary Russell Jr. has neither defended or unified the WBC title. The WBC that earlier this year ordered him to fight his mandatory challenger, Ray Vargas. They didn't give him a deadline. They didn't follow up on that. They ordered the fight didn't happen, and everybody at the WBC...
they all looked the other way.
He gets made an offer to unify titles with Josh Warrington, back when Josh Warrington still was a titleist, and what's he do? He turns it down. He turns it down to do what? I think the people at Ring Magazine made the right decision, and I don't feel sorry for him. I don't feel sorry for Gary Russell Jr.'s mediocre reign as a champion, no matter how long it lasts.
Because it's still mediocre.
It doesn't fool me. You've been a champion, 5-6 years, and you've only defended the title 5 or 6 times in 5 or 6 years?
The hell kind of title run is that?
And he doesn't even have a fight date. I mean, he has nothing on the horizon.
This guy really turned down an offer from Eddie Hearn.
How does fighting less, far less than all your other contemporaries and your stablemates, how does that lend itself to your notoriety, your marquee value, your career? I mean, in what way does it help Gary Russell Jr. that he's the least active guy with a belt?
What purpose does that serve?
And it's been going on for so long that at this point, it's by choice. I mean, you must want to be this inactive. You must want to be on this sparse schedule of activity.
It's fine, just get what that gives you.
In lightweight news, Dan Rafael tweeted, I went on MSG's website to see about the hashtag Lopez versus Kambosos Jr. tickets. Triller pay-per-view supposedly in 3 weeks. No tickets on sale. See photo. No press release announcing the event has been issued. And I spoke to Lopez's camp, which said they've had no travel itinerary or hotel rooms booked as of yet.
Should we expect another postponement?
It's possible. This fight is supposed to go down the same week as the Wilder vs. Fury trilogy. This fight is supposed to go down, supposedly, on October 4th, whereas Wilder and Fury is supposed to be fighting for the third time on October 9th. And I don't know if the event coordinators over there at Triller are feeling squirrely.
Maybe they want to move this thing.
3 weeks out from the fight? Where's the promotion for it? I've said it before and I'll say it again. Teofimo Lopez costed himself a year dealing with these people. These people that seem to be struggling to handle what is an otherwise minor fight. I mean, this ain't a major fight in the sport of boxing that this much time should have been poured into it. This fight has faced several bumps in the road, several hiccups. It's the kind of fight that a top rank could have got done easy peasy lemon squeezy, but you didn't want to let them do it. You didn't want to do it at their price.
You thought the grass was greener on the other side.
And now you've been stuck on that side ever since.
He shot himself in the foot.
And you're still gonna bump into one or two guys who want to defend Teofimo Lopez's decision. You're still gonna bump into one or two guys that can't see the forest for the trees. That not only has this costed Teofimo Lopez all the momentum that he gained, beating Vasyl Lomachenko and becoming the man to beat in this division, it's costed him more than just a year. You have to consider that.
What are the ticket sales for this fight gonna look like?
And the pay-per-view buys. How is this very ordinary fight going to perform in the open market? Because depending on how it performs, it can be used as an indictment
against Teofimo Lopez,
against his marquee value. You had all these big demands for what you think you should get for a fight moving forward, and you jumped the gun. You spoke too soon. You overestimated your marquee value.
This thing don't perform well, they can use that against you.
In spite of Teofimo Lopez racking up the biggest win anywhere at or around these weights, anywhere at or around 135 pounds, beating the pound-for-pound darling Vasyl Lomachenko. In spite of all of this,
you've costed yourself that momentum,
turned a mountain into a molehill, turned what was otherwise an innocuous situation for Teofimo Lopez, the newly crowned unified champion.
This was a run-of-the-mill title defense.
It was never supposed to be a big deal. I have nothing against George Kambosos Jr., but it's safe to say that a fight with George in this country, that's not a big fight. That's not a big mega fight. A big marquee event that should consume this much time and this many resources, having to be constantly moved, delayed, postponed.
You've let an entire year go by fucking around with these people.
And for what? So that you can make a little bit more money for this fight? You do realize that had you let Top Rank do the fight, yeah, you wouldn't have made as much for this fight, but you would have made more in the year of 2021 overall, because you would have fought more than just once in the year of 2021. And in all likelihood, it would have been in a big fight, a very big fight that comes with a very big purse. As it stands, you wanted to squander your time on this.
We don't even know where we are with this.
Should tickets for the fight become available by the time that this video is uploaded, the same applies. Jumping into bed with Triller has had an adverse effect on Teofimo's very young career.
It costed him a lot of time.
When this news first broke, that Triller won the purse bid as opposed to Matchroom, as opposed to Top Rank, you had a lot of bleeding hearts telling you that Teofimo was right to go out there and get what he's worth. Well, he's finding out what he's worth.
He is now.
And just because the people over there at Triller were willing to gamble with that much of their own money, stake $6 million on what isn't a $6 million fight.
That don't mean that's what you're worth.
We don't know what you're worth until you show that you can bring Triller that $6 million back. And if you can't,
then you should have never been making all those demands to begin with.
In other news, I'm sure most of you've heard by now, per tweet from Michael Benson, it's official. Terrence Crawford versus Sean Porter is now a done deal for November 20th at the Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas. Top Rank's Carl Moretti has confirmed Crawford's WBO welterweight title on the line. Purse bids canceled as Top Rank and PBC have agreed to a deal. This news broke earlier today at 10:26 a.m.
The 11th hour.
Figuratively, of course, I've long maintained that out of all the PBC's star welterweights, Sean Porter was the only one among them I felt would fight Terrence Crawford, could fight Terrence Crawford. I won't lie to you, I maintained a certain level of skepticism, a healthy level, because boxing has been a bit disappointing the last couple of weeks, the last couple of months. There have been a lot of letdowns. But out of all the guys they got over there, Keith Thurman, Errol Spence Jr., Danny Garcia, and Sean Porter, given Sean's track record as opposed to theirs, Sean has exhibited that he really is willing to fight with anybody, because he has. He's fought Kell Brook, he's fought Keith Thurman, he's fought Danny Garcia, Garcia. He fought Yordenis Ugas. He fought Errol Spence Jr. He fought Adrian Broner. He fought Adrian Granados.
I didn't want to get my hopes up.
But out of all the guys they've got over there on PBC's Isolation Island, if anyone among them is going to fight Terrence Crawford, I felt it'd be Sean before it would be a lot of other guys. A lot of other guys like Danny Garcia, Keith Thurman, guys who talk a good one.
These are just preliminary reports.
The fight is being confirmed by none other than Top Rank's Carl Moretti. We need to see more of this in the American boxing scene. More promotional outfits and more stables of fighters working together to bring about big fights, big events that people are actually asking for, people actually want to see. As strange as this might sound, Crawford versus Porter is the preeminent marquee event going down in the welterweight division. Emphasis on welterweight division. There is no other fight quite like this fight going down this year that has this much interest.
And I encourage all of you to buy it.
Because I know I am. This is the kind of matchmaking we want to see more of in the sport of boxing. And you have to send that message to the powers that be, the promoters, the platforms, the networks.
With your patronage.
By making that purchase. If you want more bipartisanship in the sport of boxing and you're actually a fan of this matchmaking, it's got to show up in the numbers so that we can see more of this kind of matchmaking between different promotional outfits, different stables of fighters. It shouldn't be a last resort. Mike Coppinger tweets that Top Rank is going to be the lead promoter for this thing, and that comes as a surprise to no one. Bob Arum did say that the people at the PBC are all tied up with Wilder and Fury and Canelo versus Plant, and maybe they ain't got it in the budget to pay for this thing, so what they're going to do is they're going to let Top Rank do the fight. And it seems that time has proven him right.
Top Rank's the lead promoter.
I'll be honest when I say that I think that the people over there at the PBC perhaps have bitten off more than they can chew with that Canelo Alvarez versus Caleb Plant situation, because we still don't have an official fight date, an official fight poster. The fight's not even registered on BoxRec, but they're supposed to be handling that. It's supposed to be going down. And it feels like they've exhausted their resources trying to bring that fight into fruition, so it's made them a little bit more open-minded enough that they'll let their guy Sean Porter have a fight over there on the Top Rank side of things. As it stands, you have 2 pay-per-views set to go down in the month of November. You're supposed to have Canelo Alvarez versus Caleb Plant on the 6th, and then you're supposed to have Crawford versus Porter later on towards the end of the month on the 20th.
Barring any unforeseen circumstances.
And this is boxing done right. This is what happens when everybody in the sport of boxing does their job. Because lest we forget, it's the WBO that ordered this thing. It's the WBO that put both of these guys and both of their teams on the spot to do a fight. And that's what they did. Terrence Crawford is the champion, Sean Porter is the challenger, and it's up to the fighters to do the fight because it takes 2 to tango. It takes 2 guys and 2 teams to make a fight, but it only takes 1 to fuck it all up.
Thankfully, that didn't happen here.
As far as what I think is going to happen in the fight's mechanics, well, I've broached this subject before, and need I remind you? What do I think would happen if you put Terrence Crawford and Sean Porter in the ring at the same time? Ladies and gentlemen, I will say that this is where Terrence Crawford's previous experiences with smaller fighters that can really move, have a low center of gravity, and know how to angle their torsos to get under and or around a fighter's jab and his sweeping hooks. This is where his experiences with the likes of a Lopez-Kambosos, his experiences with the likes of a Felix Diaz, this is where those experiences would really service him. I will say, comparatively, that Sean Porter is a more durable fighter than those guys. He's got a better chin than a Felix Diaz, and he's got a better chin than a Lopez-Kambosos. You know, that's what he's got on those guys.
He takes a better punch.
But what makes those fights similar is that Terrence Crawford would be a guy with a height advantage and a reach advantage, and the task before him would be controlling the room and the real estate so that he can continue to fight his fight, as opposed to being drawn into Sean's fight, like how Errol Spence was drawn into Sean's fight. I talked about it in my weekend recap video, how, you know, it became very clear early in the fight, painfully obvious, that Errol Spence's jab has been diffused because you really can't stop this guy from getting into his desired range. He's constantly closing the gap on you, and you can do little more than engage him in what is his fight, because we all know Sean Porter is a phone booth fighter. Well, I don't think that would happen to Terrence Crawford, because it just so happens that Terrence Crawford has more experience in that area than Errol Spence had ahead of that Sean Porter fight.
How so?
In the Yuriorkis-Gamboa fight, in the Felix Diaz fight, Terence Crawford was faced with a task to where he's got to be able to nail the smaller fighter coming in. Now, in the Gamboa fight, back when Gamboa was undefeated, he was a fresher guy. This is a fighter who's light on his feet. He's very nimble. He's got in and out game. He knows how to be elusive, good hand speed. He's got all these things, and he brings these things to the table to help him close the gap on what is a more statuesque fighter than himself. And this is a fight where Terence Crawford struggled. I mean, Gamboa had moments in this fight. We all know how it worked out. We all know that eventually Terence Crawford bounced his ass off the fucking canvas like a football, so there's that. And he took those experiences with a guy that has smaller dimensions and is very elusive. He took those experiences over to the Felix Diaz fight. He had those experiences with Gamboa to draw from in the Diaz fight. And in the Diaz fight, he didn't struggle at all, with that guy. And it's a similar situation to where you're facing a fighter who's a smaller guy with a lower center of gravity who can really move, but still has to close the gap to get to you because he's the smaller fighter. There's no way the smaller guy's going to be able to fight the fight from the outside. You're a sitting duck out there. So both a Gamboa and a Diaz and a Sean Porter, they have that same task in front of them to where they have to close the gap to fight their fight. And it is there where Crawford's previous experiences would serve him the best, that he has the kind of accuracy, the kind of sharpshooting abilities that Errol Spence didn't have, because up until that Porter fight, he was never faced with that kind of an opponent, that kind of a situation, whereas Terence Crawford has been here at least 2 times already against two, count them, 2 Olympic gold medalists, because need I remind you, Yuriorkis-Gamboa, Felix Diaz, they both came from an Olympic background, and they were both Olympic gold medalists. And the underlying principle of those fights, the dynamic of those situations, is very similar to the dynamic of a Sean Porter situation, because he's got to get within his desired range the same way they did. And what would be required of Crawford is to fight on the fly. But not just fighting on the fly for sake of fighting on the fly, not just sticking and moving, but being accurate, being a sharpshooter, catching the guy with jabs over the top as he's trying to come in, walking him into shots like lead uppercuts. You know what kind of fight Sean Porter wants to fight. You know where he needs to be to fight that fight. And in that way, you can anticipate his movements. This is something that Terence Crawford has had to do in the past, and it's likely what he would do with Sean Porter. My prediction for such a fight, if it were to ever to come into fruition, my prediction is that Terence Crawford would stop Sean Porter, and he'd stop him late. Sean Porter, I reiterate, is a more durable guy than a Yuriorkis-Gamboa. He's a more durable guy than a Felix Diaz. So it would be one of the more physically taxing fights that Terence Crawford will have been in, but he's got the kind of accuracy, the kind of mobility, the switch hitting that he can attack Sean Porter from different angles, even whilst on the fly. He can attack him as an orthodox fighter or a southpaw. Whatever works and whatever is needed in the moment, because we all know Terence Crawford adapts on the go. And Terence Crawford, unlike Errol Spence, he doesn't need to be at a particular range throwing a particular set of punches to generate power. Terence Crawford generates as much power with his straight punches as he does with his bent arm punches, with his hooks. He doesn't need to be in a particular range to fire off power shots, whereas in the case of Errol Spence, Errol's power in the phone booth isn't what it is mid-range to outside. Mid-range to outside, Errol Spence generates very good power, but when he's in that phone booth, his work is being smothered. Terence Crawford, on the other hand, he can throw bent arm punches on the inside or straight shots from the outside, and they all got a lot of mustard on them. I'll say that I think the fight would test Crawford's physicality. I mean, if it really were going to be a litmus test for something, it would be that. It would be Crawford's condition, having to maintain that pace with Sean Porter, who we all know is a high-octane, high-volume puncher. If there's anything that would be tested in that fight, when it comes to Crawford, it would be his physicality. But accuracy, being a sniper, being a sharpshooter, that's what would win him the fight. And I've no doubts that's a fight he would win.